Russian President Vladimir Putin visits Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. This is his first trip to the region since the war commenced. Rachel Levine, the transgender Secretary of Health for the U.S. government, stated that gender-affirming care will soon be normalized in the United States. And finally, because this week marks 20 years since the United States invasion of Iraq, I'm going to discuss what Iraqi society looks like now and some U.S. foreign policy interventions that culminated in our disastrous intervention in 2003. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hello friends, it is Tuesday, March 21st, 2023. I hope that you are having a great week. Just a reminder to please like, comment, and subscribe to this show. And you can also follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. Now, you may hear from my voice. Those of you who have listened to the show know that my voice usually doesn't sound like this. I apologize for the fact that it's a little raspy, though I'm sort of digging the raspy vibe. I know actually, one of my producers gave me a thumbs up. I actually know women who purposefully make their voice raspy because they think that it sounds sexier or, I don't know, casual and less try-hardy. This is because I actually just returned from New York City, where I was for a few days, and I was mostly visiting some of my best friends from college. And let's just say that we went out and I talked to a lot of my friends at very loud and crowded bars, and it produced this, which is interestingly, not really a concern for them because they don't work in front of the camera, so they can shout as loudly as they want in a crowded bar and it will have no consequence for them. But for me, I've got to take care of this voice. So forgive me for today. Hopefully by tomorrow it will be a little better. On to our first news story of the day. Russian President Vladimir Putin has visited two parts of Ukraine, Mariupol and Crimea. Now, you notice that I hesitated a little bit when I said Mariupol because before the show I was talking with my producers about how you pronounce that. Last week we played for you this really funny online database guy who comes up with or tells us how to pronunciate certain words. So can we play him? Do you have him?
How to pronounce this
yeah,
name.
this guy.
The name of the city in Ukraine, Mariupol.
Mariupol
is how it is said, Mariupol. And now you know.
And now you know. So that's how apparently it is pronounced, though. I could just be a little devious and think that most people don't know how to pronounce it and they wouldn't know if I'm saying it rightly or wrongly, but I do want to get to the right pronunciation. Anyway, Vladimir Putin has visited these two parts of Ukraine over the past few days, which again marks his first trip to Ukrainian territory, since before the invasion. So let's start off with Mariupol. It is in the Donbass region, which is in the east of the country of Ukraine. And actually the Donbass region consists of two oblasts, which are essentially regions or provinces. One is called Donetsk and one is Luhansk. So Mariupol is actually in Donetsk. And for those of you who have been following the war in Ukraine, you know that this eastern part of Ukraine has somewhat, I would say it's a maybe 10 or 15% minority of Russophone and Russophile population, meaning that the population speaks Russian and some are sympathetic to Russia. So President Putin has focused a lot of his armies fighting in this eastern part of Ukraine to try to, quote unquote, reunite it with the Russian motherland. So for Ukrainians, they are obviously viewing this visit to this region as a symbol of Russian brutality. The exiled Ukrainian mayor of this city has estimated that at least 22,000 people have died since President Putin's invasion back in February of 2022. Now, Mariupol has a total population of 40,000 people. So if it's true that 22,000 have died, my God, that is obviously a significant number. Now, this is coming after the International Criminal Court actually recently issued an arrest warrant for Putin and other Kremlin officials for war crimes, specifically deportation of Ukrainian children in these eastern parts of the country. But for Russians, for Putin and some of his supporters, they view his visit to Mariupol as a victory, as a way to liberate the city from who Putin calls Nazis. Now, I'm going to show a video for you of President Putin actually driving around in Mariupol, and he is speaking with some of the citizens there and promising to build infrastructure projects in the area, including hospitals, schools, and repairing buildings. So let's look at this clip.
By the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes, Russian President Vladimir Putin paid a visit to a city his forces largely destroyed. A Kremlin camera filmed the leader driving a car into the outskirts of Mariupol.
Это маленький кусочек рая сейчас у нас здесь. Это маленький кусочек рая.
There, some residents living in houses built by the Russian government welcomed Putin into their homes.
Не будем вас беспокоить. Извините, пожалуйста, что так неожиданно.
Спасибо, что зашли. Мы так рады видеть вас.
Part of a visit aimed at highlighting Russian efforts to rebuild parts of the city. A top Kremlin official describing plans to build new schools, hospitals, and homes, while also demolishing the ruins of shattered apartment buildings.
Though this is being shown on CNN, we have to remember that these clips that are being provided to CNN are coming from Russian state news. So it makes sense that Putin is only going to show clips of him meeting with people in this region who are sympathetic to him. Now, going back to what I said just about a moment ago, that Putin is viewing coming to this territory as a symbol of his army's liberation of the city from Nazis. You know, that's something that we've heard a lot throughout the past year. It's one of the greatest pieces of Russian pro-Russian propaganda in support of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that they are reuniting Ukraine, which was a former Soviet socialist republic, with Russia, but also that they are liberating the country from Nazis. That always fascinated me. And so I've done some more research that I'd like to share with you as to why there is this propaganda, this argument that Putin is liberating Russia or Ukrainians who are sympathetic to Russia from Ukrainian Nazis. So first of all, there is this brigade in the Ukrainian army. It's called the Azov Brigade. And actually, it's pretty much headquartered in this eastern part of the country, Mariupol. And they do blatantly have a Nazi ideology. Now, it is worth noting, though, that this is just one part of the Ukrainian army. This is not the entirety of the Ukrainian army. In fact, there is evidence that most of the Ukrainian army does not have Nazi ideology, but there is this one brigade that does. But more broadly, where this argument is coming from actually dates back to World War II. As I have spoken about on this show, in 1932 and through 1933, there was the Holodomor, which was initiated by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in Ukraine. It was actually a man-made starvation of the citizens. And what was behind it is that Joseph Stalin wanted to collectivize the land in Ukraine, though there were these peasants that were in control of the land called kulaks who resisted collectivization. So in order to achieve his goal, he inflicted this man-made famine. So Ukrainians, for obvious reasons, hated communism and hated Joseph Stalin. So when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, within the first 2 to 3 weeks, they captured millions of Ukrainian POWs. Some estimate as high as 2 to 3 million. And especially, They specifically captured a lot of Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians. And what the Nazis essentially said to them was, you have two options. You are either going to go into a prison camp where we are not going to feed you, we are going to torture you, and you are going to die, or you can join our army. So many Ukrainians chose the latter. They joined the Nazi army because A, they did not want to die, and B, because again, they hated communism and specifically Joseph Stalin so much. So it's not so much that they were sympathetic to the Nazi regime, but it's that they were put in this situation of having to choose, and they chose to serve instead of die. So what happened was Russians became very suspicious of Ukrainians, and this even continued after World War II, and evidently it has continued even after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. They argue that they are not quite as patriotic as they should be, and that Russians do call many of these Ukrainians Nazis and traitors for that history. That I just mentioned. You know, my paternal grandfather, who has been dead for about 15 years, actually during World War II, he served in New York, and he was in charge of guarding prisoners of war. And I remember one of the things when I was very young that he told me was that when the war ended and Ukrainians were told that they were going to go back to the Soviet Union, many of them tried to kill themselves and tried to resist so fervently going back to the Soviet Union because they knew what would happen to them if they returned. In fact, the Ukrainian prisoners of war who did go back to the Soviet Union after the war actually were shot right on the spot after they got off the ships and the planes. Stalin shot them, in front of the Americans who had just returned them after accusing them of being Nazis. So that is where that history comes from, and why Vladimir Putin is going to this region and continuing this propaganda that he is liberating the area from Nazis in order to reunite those Ukrainians who are sympathetic with Russia with the Russian motherland. He also visited Crimea, which actually to this week, or I believe it was either last week or this week, marks 9 years since Putin's invasion of Crimea, where he seized the peninsula. He has occupied that region since. I did about 30-minute segment on this show where I talked to you about some of the developments that have led up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And I'd like to remind you why Crimea is so strategically important to Putin. It really centers around this naval base called Sevastopol. Now, again, as I said, Crimea is a peninsula that juts out into the Black Sea. And this naval base of Sevastopol is incredibly strategically important to whoever possesses it because it is a deep water naval base, which can accommodate some of the largest ships in the region that can traverse through the Black Sea and then make its way into the Mediterranean. And actually, Crimea, and specifically that port of Sevastopol, has a very interesting history. It once was a part of the Ottoman Empire, but then in 1783, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia seized it from the Ottoman Empire, in a sort of odd or eerie parallel to what happened in 2014, and made it part of Russia. And then, in another sort of bizarre twist, in 1954, during the time of the Soviet Union, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made a seemingly ununderstandable but hugely consequential decision where he transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, because ever since Empress Catherine the Great took Crimea, it still belonged to Russia, even during the time of the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It is as if President Eisenhower in 1954 had ordered the transfer of Long Island from New York State to Connecticut State. During the time in 1954, when Crimea became a part of Ukraine, there were actually 3 times as many Russians as Ukrainians in Crimea, which again sort of speaks to Putin's ideas that by re-seizing Crimea, as he did in 2014, he was reuniting his own people with the Russian motherland. In 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, Crimea remained a part of Ukraine. But unfortunately, in 1997, the Ukrainian government signed this agreement with Russia that had unforeseen consequences that sadly we know today, where Ukraine agreed to grant the Russian Navy the right to use, alongside the Ukrainian Navy, that deep water seaport, that Soviet-era naval base at Sevastopol as the home port for the largest Russian warships. So the Russian Navy and the Ukrainian Navy actually agreed to jointly share control of Sevastopol, and their agreement expired in 2017, which is why President Putin likely invaded at the time that he did, 3 years before the expiration of that agreement. Though President Putin is visiting Ukraine now, he has said that he would like to make many more trips in the upcoming months. Of course, he is arguing that the war is going in his favor. Whereas the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said the opposite, that his side is winning and that he plans to retake all of the lost territory that Ukraine has lost to Russia, including that peninsula of Crimea. Currently, Ukrainian and Russian forces are battling for the eastern city of Bakhmut, which I'm going to put a map of now. And in an even more eerie development, President Xi Jinping of China is visiting Russia this week to talk with President Putin about possible peace deals. A few weeks ago, the United States actually rejected a 12-point plan that President Xi Jinping of China presented to the United States in order to facilitate peace conversations, in order to end the war in Ukraine. So President Xi has said that he would like to facilitate an end, but it seems, of course, that he is going to do it in a way that would be favorable towards Russia. Later this week, I will keep you updated on what happened during that meeting. Now, in other news, this time domestic news, Dr. Rachel Levine, who is a transgender assistant secretary for health for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the abbreviation of which is HHS, has come out and said that gender-affirming care will soon be normalized. She was recently on the Connecticut Children's Grand Rounds podcast when she made these remarks, and she said that attacks on so-called gender-affirming care are, quote, ideologically or politically motivated. And she also said that states who pass laws to affirm this so-called gender-affirming care, which is really just state-sanctioned mutilation of young children, she called the states who have actually combated that, such as Utah and Mississippi, quote, regressive, negative, and discriminatory. Let's listen to some other remarks that Dr. Rachel Levine has made about gender-affirming care in recent weeks.
There is substantial misinformation about gender-affirming care for transgender and gender-diverse individuals. The positive value of gender-affirming care for youth and adults is not in scientific or medical dispute. We need to use our clinicians' voice to collectively advocate for our tech companies to create a healthier, cleaner information environment.
I don't need to explain to you, if you have a brain, why that was just so idiotic. But the fact that she would even say that it is not under scientific or medical dispute is, first of all, such a lie. And second of all, it doesn't need to be under scientific or medical dispute. If you have common sense, you can see why it should be disputed. And of course, it isn't true that it isn't under scientific or medical dispute. In fact, we are seeing a lot of lawsuits from teenagers who had their healthy breast or genital tissue cut off on behalf or facilitated by certain hospitals who embrace this so-called gender-affirming care. Most recently, a detransitioned teenager named Layla Jane is suing Kaiser Permanente Medical Group and the Kaiser Foundation hospitals, who are the medical providers who performed a double mastectomy on her when she was 13 years old. And she had started identifying as transgender just 2 years before. And then a few years after this double mastectomy, she realized that it was a terrible mistake. And now she is suing this hospital and saying that they told her, when, again, she was just 13 years old, that getting a double mastectomy was, quote, the only way forward for her. Dr. Rachel Levine has said that gender-affirming care has, quote, the highest support of the Biden administration. And she appears to be right, because in a recent interview, President Biden seemed to imply that there should be a way to codify minors' right to gender-affirming care into law. Let's listen to what he said.
Transgender kids is a really harder thing. What's going on in Florida is, as my mother would say, close to sinful. I mean, it's just terrible what they're doing. It's not like, you know, a kid wakes up one morning and says, you know, I decided I want to become a man, or I want to become a woman, or I want to change. I mean, what are they thinking about here? They're human beings. They love, they have feelings, they have inclinations that are, I mean, it just, to me, is, I don't know, it's cruel. And the way we do it is we make sure we pass legislation like we passed on same-sex marriage. You mess with that, you're breaking the law, and you're going to be held accountable.
That's right. That's actually, I opened up that clip by saying that he was implying it, but he seems to be very clear that he wants it to be codified into law. You know, it is no secret that people have spoken very much recently about the quote-unquote ugly stains on our history. And of course, like any country, we have them. Slavery, Jim Crow, internment camps. There are many things in this country that have gone wrong. But I think in the fullness of time, we will look back on this era now, where there is state-sanctioned mutilation of young children in the name of so-called gender-affirming care. We are going to look back on that as something alongside those other parts of our history that we talk about and focus so much now. And what's even sadder about this is that we are providing our adversaries with fodder to destroy us and to turn their populations against us. President Putin gave a 100-minute State of the Union address a few weeks ago in Russia, actually just after the 1-year mark of his invasion of Ukraine. And one of the things that he said in that address is that the West is, quote, normalizing pedophilia. And I hate to say it, but he's right. Again, we are giving our foreign adversaries reasons to dislike us when we have always been a beacon of hope and moral uprightness for the rest of the world. We are falling down on that egregiously. And if you look at what's going on here, where we have adults that are coming out and saying that it is regressive, negative, and discriminatory to deny a 13-year-old a double mastectomy, we see a sort of cultural problem that has been brewing for about a decade and is really coming to fruition now. And that is the difference between tolerance and outright endorsement and support. Back in the early 2000s, when the push to legalize gay marriage really gained momentum, one of the things that homosexual individuals said was that they want tolerance. And you know what? Everyone deserves tolerance. In fact, in order to live in a pluralistic society, we have to afford tolerance to those around us. That doesn't mean that we tolerate people who commit crimes or who are murderers, but we have to tolerate people who have different lifestyle choices or beliefs than we do, because that's part of the deal of living in this country. But tolerance is very different from outright enthusiastic support. We all should be able to tolerate those who are transgender. But what we are seeing right now is not tolerance, but proselytizing, where people like Dr. Rachel Levine and President Biden, who are arguing that gender-affirming care should be codified into law, what they are trying to do is force people to not just tolerate them, but enthusiastically support them, and to take it a step further, adopt their lifestyle choices. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a practice. Actually, it was pretty much outlawed during the 70s, but certainly during the 60s, there was a practice in some American public schools with children who wrote with their right hand, or with their left hand, were actually instructed to write with their right hand because it was viewed as the proper way to do things. But with time, educators came to see that maybe that wasn't exactly the best move, that we should allow people who were born as a lefty to be able to write that way. What I would like to ask people is, how is what is going on now any different from what we saw in American public schools in the 60s, where children were being forced to write with a different hand that was not natural to them. I'll tell you actually what's different. This is far more serious than changing what hand you write with. This is permanently altering someone's body and screwing up the rest of their lives. And it seems, at least to me, that these individuals in our government who are advocating for this should be criminally charged for the way that they are treating young people who are not yet wise or fully formed enough to make decisions on their own. Now, in our final topic of today, this year marks 20 years since the United States invasion of Iraq. And I would like to talk to you a little bit about the history surrounding our 2003 invasion and, crucially, some of the events that led up to it that made that catastrophe in 2003 and onwards more possible. It was sort of stunning to see yesterday, which was March 20th, that was the actual day of the invasion, that American newspapers, at least the ones I read, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, did not even acknowledge that it had been 20 years since this momentous event. To start with what has happened in Iraq since 2003, what is really upsetting now to see is that Iraq is actually a client state of Iran, which, as I'm going to explain to you, was its previous adversary, is one of the staunchest adversaries of the United States. And for those who may be skeptical that Iraq is a client state of Iran, I'd like to tell you that most of the Iraqi government is Shiite. Iran is a majority Shiite country, and prior to the 2003 invasion, Iraq was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni, and so now most of the government has become Shiite. And back in 2020, when President Donald Trump famously assassinated, or I guess the American army assassinated him at the orders of Donald Trump, the head of the Iranian army, the General Soleimani, guess where he was? He wasn't in Iran, but he was actually in Iraq, in Baghdad. So now Iraq is so weak that it has turned into a client state of one of our greatest adversaries. In 2003, when we launched our invasion, Vice President Dick Cheney predicted that we Americans would be greeted as liberators. And for a time, that was certainly true. Iraqis who had suffered under the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein for decades cheered when Americans came into the streets and famously, just after 3 weeks, toppled that statue of Saddam in Fidars Square in Iraq and overthrew his Ba'athist government. But quickly after that, what happened was that Americans did not have a long-term strategy of what to be able to do in Iraq. We had achieved what we set out to do, which was topple Saddam Hussein and his government. But there was really not very much that came to replace that. We did set up a provisional coalition government in Iraq, but within just a few years, Iraq descended into sectarian conflict. Al-Qaeda, of course, the famous terrorist organization which executed the attack on our soil on 9/11, is a primarily Sunni Islamist organization. And in 2006, it came into Iraq, which actually has a majority Shiite population, despite for most of its history being ruled by a Sunni, and started to massacre and attack Shiite members of the population and famously bombed a Shiite mosque. So from 2006 to 2008, there was a sectarian civil war in Iraq between the Sunnis and the Shias. And then, in a crazy twist, ISIS, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, metastasized in 2004, actually in response to the United States invasion of Iraq. So after American forces helped push out Al-Qaeda and quell the sectarian conflict that happened from 2006 to 2008, ISIS then came and took over a third of the country in Iraq, most famously the second largest city in Iraq, the northern city of Mosul. In 2 days on this program, I'm actually going to be interviewing an Iraqi citizen. His name is Omar Mohammed, who created an underground resistance movement called Mosul Eye. He created this resistance movement in response to ISIS. Several years of half-hearted attempts by the Obama administration to uproot ISIS proved to be a failure, but in 2017, when President Donald Trump took office, he launched these drone strikes, which, at least for now, rid Iraq of the ISIS cancer. But ever since then, Iraq has continued to be in disarray. The United States formally withdrew all of our troops in 2011, and now actually many Iraqi citizens say that as bad as Saddam Hussein was, they would actually prefer to have him back than the government or lack of government that exists now. And again, Iraq is now a client state of our adversary, Iran. So as with almost everything I talk about, I like to consider, how did we get here? How did this happen? Now, of course, we know that in 2003, the United States entered Iraq under false pretenses that Saddam Hussein had aided Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in executing the attack on 9/11, and that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Both were proven not to be true. Saddam Hussein did possess some chemical weapons of destruction, but the ones that the United States thought he possessed, and indeed the ones that we went to war over trying to eliminate, were nuclear weapons, which Saddam Hussein did not possess. And really, if you look at what happened in Iraq in 2003, you can see that it was a culmination of some foreign policy mistakes that Americans made in the Middle East dating back to the middle of the 20th century. In the fullness of time, these mistakes built on one another. It seems that in interpersonal relations and in international relations, sometimes when we make mistakes, we don't always see the effects of them. But these seemingly two roads converged in 2003, and we saw all of our mistakes sort of come together. The origin of the United States and Iraq's troubled entanglement goes back actually to 1980, when Saddam Hussein, again the dictator of Iraq, invaded Iran. Now you may be wondering why he would invade Iran in 1980. And the answer is that Iran, like Iraq, but really it's especially concentrated in Iran, is a hub for oil. Iran has very, very, very rich oil mines, and Saddam wanted to seize control of that. Also, Iran, as I said, is a Shiite majority population, and Saddam, as a Sunni ruling over a Shiite majority population in Iraq, feared that the Shiites in Iran would try to create some trouble among the Iraqi Shiites against Saddam's Sunni government. So he wanted to invade Iran and take control of Iran in order to sort of have control of all of the Shiite populations to prevent them from rebelling against him. But one of the biggest reasons why Saddam invaded Iran in 1980 was because he viewed Iran as weak. In 1979, as I discussed on the show during an Iranian history episode, Iran underwent a revolution where the Islamic Republic of Iran was established that ousted the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and instated Ayatollah Khomeini as the ruler of Iran. And here we see, again, sort of one of the seeds that led ultimately, or sort of created the circumstances that made our 2003 invasion of Iraq more likely, because we helped the Shah come to power in Iran. But then in the 1970s, when there was a lot of unrest in Iran, there was a lot of people protesting the Shah from all different parts of the population, the rural poor, the urban elite, also Shiite fundamentalists. They opposed the Shah. And all of a sudden, we, the United States, who helped to install the Shah in 1953, turned our backs on him. President Jimmy Carter visited Tehran on New Year's Eve in 1977, and he praised the Shah's policies. He called his regime, quote, an island of stability in one of the most troubled areas of the world. But then less than a year later, when more of these uprisings were happening in Iran, in a press conference in December of 1978, Carter hedged his support for the Shah, proclaiming, quote, we personally prefer that the Shah remain a major role, but that this is a decision for the Iranian people to make. So once the United States turned our backs on the Shah, he had to flee to Egypt, and then very quickly in 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini took over the Iranian government. So Saddam Hussein of Iraq in 1980, after this revolution in 1979, saw an opening and invaded Iran. This war between Iran and Iraq lasted for 8 years until 1988. And it really ended in a stalemate. Saddam Hussein not only didn't take over Iran, but he didn't succeed really in any way. After the war, it only left Saddam in debt. So what Saddam did is he pleaded to OPEC. OPEC, of course, is the group of Arab and Middle Eastern countries that come together to set oil prices. And he begged them to raise oil prices in order to pay off the debt for the war. OPEC was unmoved by Saddam's entreaties, told him that he had to deal with the consequences of the war that he waged against Iran. And then Saddam made the very famous decision in 1990 to invade Kuwait. Kuwait is another oil-rich country. It also has a majority Sunni population, so Saddam was sort of doing the opposite in Kuwait of what he was doing in Iran. In Iran, he wanted to bring the Shiites together so that he could control them and quell them, but in invading Kuwait, he wanted to bring the Sunnis together in order to have more Sunnis under his population and to support his rule. And then President George H.W. Bush, the father, president number 41, created a coalition of our NATO allies, as well as Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Egypt, to invade Kuwait in order to push Saddam and his army back into Iraq. So here is yet another way that our American foreign policy mistakes in the Middle East sort of built upon one another. This invasion of Kuwait, called the First Gulf War, where we helped liberate Kuwait from Iraq, is seen as a victory because, again, we helped liberate Kuwait and preserve it as an autonomous country. However, this had some disastrous and unforeseen consequences that at the time we did not see, but that actually may have created the circumstances that led to 9/11. Now, of course, our foreign policy interventions in the Middle East cannot be the total reason for why 9/11 happened or why we got into the war in Iraq. But again, I just want to highlight that these certain mistakes did add up on one another. After Osama bin Laden ordered the detonation of the bomb in the early 90s in the World Trade Center, which did not succeed in bringing down the towers, but did kill a few Americans. He issued a jihad against the United States. And he cited 3 reasons for why he wanted to terrorize the United States. The first one was the United States' support of Israel. The second one was the United States embargo on Iraq. And the third one was that U.S. forces were stationed in the Holy Lands, the Muslim Holy Lands of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. If you look at reasons 2 and 3, the embargo on Iraq and U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, those 2 are direct consequences of the United States invasion of Kuwait. Now, of course, many will argue, and it is a legitimate argument, that it was right for us to liberate Kuwait because Saddam was unjust in invading an autonomous country, and who knows what Saddam would have done next had he had succeeded in Kuwait. My view on this is a little bit more nuanced. Certainly what we could and should have done is provide the Kuwaiti army with weapons and financial support, but an all-out invasion of the country I don't believe was something that we were obligated to do. You know, in the 1970s, there was the famous OPEC embargo on the United States, which was characterized by long gas lines where Americans couldn't fill their cars with gas. For many months, it was a disaster for us. And Kuwait was a part of that. Kuwait did not do anything to try to stop that in our hour of need. So why did we have the obligation in their hour of need to come to their defense, again, in a full outright military invasion. Certainly some help to them would have been good and perhaps necessary, but an all-out invasion seemed to be excessive. And we saw here the effects because A, we imposed an embargo on Iraq in order to punish them for invading Kuwait. And even after the first Gulf War ended, we, the United States, kept that embargo on Iraq. We did not buy Iraqi goods, and we also prohibited people from selling Iraqis medicine, food, and oil and other supplies, which very much angered Osama bin Laden because Iraq, of course, is a Muslim country. And also, after this first Gulf War, we kept United States forces in Saudi Arabia in these holy lands. We did not withdraw our forces once we left Kuwait. And Osama bin Laden and other Muslims viewed that as an affront to their culture. There is a very strict law in Muslim culture where infidels or non-believers of the Muslim faith are not allowed to step foot or go to the holy cities in Saudi Arabia. So again, Osama bin Laden took great umbrage to those two reasons, and it was part of why he did execute the attack on 9/11. Again, it's really important to note, I am not blaming the United States entirely for what happened on 9/11, but certain things did add up. We originally supported the Shah in Iran. We turned our back on the Shah in Iran. That allowed the 1979 revolution to happen, which created an opportunity for Saddam to invade Iran in 1980. Because Saddam invaded Iran in 1980 and the war was such a disaster for him, he entreated to OPEC and then invaded Kuwait in order to get oil to pay off the war debt. And then when we invaded Kuwait, in order to help liberate the Kuwaiti people, we did certain things, this embargo and keeping our forces in Saudi Arabia, that made people like Osama bin Laden very, very upset. And then, of course, we didn't learn from our mistakes after 9/11 by sort of zooming out and trying to take a tempered approach to Middle Eastern foreign policy by assuming that Saddam Hussein had colluded with Osama bin Laden in executing the attack on 9/11. Though both Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden are Sunnis, they actually were quite different. Saddam was a secular ruler of the Ba'athist Party. Osama bin Laden was a religious fundamentalist who wanted to see an Islamic caliphate be restored not just in the Middle East, but in the rest of the world where people would abide by Sharia law. So it's unfortunate that we did not see the situation in the Middle East with more nuance, and maybe it would not have led to this disastrous invasion in 2003, which may have been started off with good intentions to get rid of this terrible dictator, but again, in the fullness of time, proved to be very destructive to the Iraqi people who still do suffer in Iraq today. I do hope that you will stay tuned in 2 more days for my interview with Omar Mohammed, who I said was one of the brave Iraqi citizens who created an underground resistance movement to ISIS when ISIS took over Iraq. It will be a fabulous interview. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd like to remind you that each of our thoughts, choices, and actions shape who we are. So let's think clearly, choose wisely, and act with principle and determination. Take care.